welcome here to tonight's session on water, part of the Earth Convention that we are doing with Rathbones Investment Management, which we're doing 4 events: Earth, Air, Fire and Water. Last month we had a fantastic event about the Earth, which you can still find online, and we looked at the importance of rewilding, at green capital, and at finding collective and sustainable solutions to what we eat. It was really great, so do look it up. Tonight, we're not quite going in order, but we're going to take water, and it could not be more topical. And honestly, we couldn't have 4 better speakers lined up for you tonight. And I'm so pleased that so many of you have joined in. I think there's about 900 of you on screen at the moment. So welcome, every single one. And a big thank you to everyone who has already sent in questions. Water is probably the most vital thing next to air. We can't survive without water, but at the moment there's too much of it here and too little of it there. It is essential to life on our planet, but rising sea levels, water shortages and droughts, all of these things are going to determine how we live, where we live, what we eat, pretty much everything that we do. Tonight we're going to hear about why water matters, about marine life and the extraordinary bit of the marine life that is between the shore and the sea, the ecosystems of the tidal zone. We're also going to hear very specifically about the drastic effects of drought on one particular area, the River Po, as well as hearing about whales and what's happening in the water as the climate changes and the water warms. So we're following our usual format. Our speakers are going to speak for about 5-ish minutes. We're then going to have a chat, and then it will be over to you to ask the questions. So do start putting your questions into the chat box, and I promise I'll try and come to as many as possible. So without any further ado, I'm going to head off to our first speaker, who is called Alok Jha, and he is the science correspondent of The Economist, but he's also a scientist and researcher, and in his own right is one of the world's experts on water. So we're going right to the horse's mouth to start with, and we're going to get an overview of what water is, why it matters to us, and why we really need to see this stuff as precious. So Alok, over to you, and thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you very much indeed. It's a great pleasure to be here. Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I want to talk to you about what water is, how we use it around the world, how that use is changing, where it's surprising, and then also a little bit about, what makes water so special, why it is that we chase it so much. So I want to start by talking about the water cycle, something we all learn in school. And in the water cycle, we learn that water moves from the oceans to the sky to the land, and then on to through rivers to freshwater basins, and eventually back to oceans again. And in this version of the story, the water we use never really disappears. It just goes round and round and round. And there's an oft used anecdote about how the water you drank this morning probably used to be part of a dinosaur, millions of years ago, or the water inside you right now is the same water that used to fly around in pterodactyls or something a long time ago. And that's probably largely true. But there is something that that sort of simple story glosses over, which is that the cycle I described, the water cycle, actually is not a fast thing at all. It can take decades, hundreds of years, thousands of years sometimes to complete one of the turns that I've just mentioned. Much of the fresh water that we use, and by the way, fresh water is the 1% of the water on the earth that we can actually use. The other 99% is saline, brackish, it's frozen, so we can't use it at all. So the fresh water that we use, most of it comes from groundwater. This is in aquifers and places like that, which is water trapped underneath soil and rock, again, which has taken hundreds, thousands of years to accumulate. Some of these groundwater aquifers are tens of thousands of years old, and we are using them to do things like irrigation, crop agriculture, and much more. So if you think about it, if we use water or pollute it, or take it out and dump it into the sea faster than it can be replenished, well, of course, the resource will eventually run out. And if you think about water in this finite way, you can start to quickly see its presence in every part of the economy. It makes you realize just how much of it there is that we don't even see. So, you know about the water that you use to wash with or drink. You used to know about the water in the rivers around you that you can see, but that's very little of the actual water that you're using every day. 70% of the water that the world uses is in food production. But also, of course, water is used in everything from making T-shirts to cars to computer chips. A cup of coffee is a little bit of water, but it takes 140 liters of water to grow the beans that you use in that cup of coffee. 15,000 liters of water for a kilo of beef. 100 liters for a couple of slices of bread. You know, your meals in one day are going to be using tens of thousands of liters of water. A kilogram of cotton, depending on where it's grown, can be anything from 10,000 to 22,000 liters to actually produce. Now, this leads to some weird situations. We know that climate change is moving where water is in the world. So the fresh water, you know, is in some places there'll be too much water. There'll be floods. The life will be very difficult to lead. In other places will get drier. Many parts of the tropics, for example, that's happening. And you know, the problem is that once the water availability for a city gets difficult, then you can't just move that city. You know, many of the biggest cities in the world are where they are because of their access to water, rivers, coastlines, etc. And if those places become submerged or dry, then you can't easily move the entire city. The problem then that means that people will move too, which is already causing tensions along borders as people from, for example, certain parts of the tropics move north towards southern Europe. There are problems there because people can't eat, they can't make money, they can't do anything because water itself has moved. Now, some rich countries seem to be able to buy themselves out of this problem. So Saudi Arabia, which is mainly a desert, and large parts of China, which is, again, large parts of which are a desert, they can buy their way out of these problems for the time being by importing food. That means literally importing food, which is just another way of importing water, really. And, you know, another way of doing it is to buy farmland elsewhere. So these countries, amongst others, have been buying up huge swathes of farmland in places like sub-Saharan Africa, where the grounds are lush, parts of the American Southwest. These parts are now owned by the richer countries, and essentially they become farms for the other places, and they take water and food away from the countries where those lands actually are. In fact, the United States is the largest exporter of water on Earth. And many of you probably know, if you're interested in water, that the American West has been in a state of extreme drought for many years. Many of its rivers are dried up. There are problems with all sorts of things that need water in that part of the world. But also, it's the place that exports the most water. Just one example, a few years ago, during one extreme part of this drought, farmers in the American West used more than 100 billion gallons of water to grow a crop of alfalfa that was then shipped mostly to China. This is getting more and more contentious as water disappears in different parts of the world. That's just the outline of the environmental problems that people are facing. But why is water fundamental to life on Earth? And this is where I'm going to finish quickly, which is that water itself, and this is my specific area of expertise and interest, it's a very ubiquitous molecule. You know, it's very simple. We all kind of almost ignore it in our daily lives because it's there all the time. But it's a very odd molecule too. The way its atoms are arranged, there's two hydrogen atoms and an oxygen atom in the shape of a kind of a V. Oxygen here, oxygen there, and then the hydrogens at the other ends. Because of that particular shape, the atoms, the molecule itself is slightly electrically charged in different places, which makes it behave very unexpectedly from a scientific point of view. Scientists themselves don't often like to study water because it doesn't behave in the way that normal liquids behave. It has lots of very bizarre properties. For example, ice floats. I mean, solids shouldn't really float on their own liquids. It's not something that any other chemical does. But we sort of see ice floating as very normal. It's not very normal at all. Water can flow upwards against the force of gravity because it's got such a high surface tension. It loves to stick to itself much more than it loves to stick to anything else, which means that plants blood capillaries, all these things can move water up them against the force of gravity. So trees only exist because of this weird property of water. It's got a very high specific heat capacity. What does that mean? It means it takes a lot of energy to raise the temperature of water up. And when water cools down, it has a lot of energy coming out, which means that on the Earth, it stabilizes the temperature. So as the heat from the sun fluctuates, it means that the temperature on the Earth itself is relatively stable, which is very useful if you've got life. You don't want massive fluctuations in temperature. Now, all these weird things are happening on the Earth, but they're also happening inside our bodies. So being electrically charged, this water molecule does all sorts of interesting things. It makes sure that all the proteins inside you fold in the correct way. It allows the DNA to work. It moves energy around. And there is no other molecule that we know of that exists anywhere in the universe that can do all of these bizarre things. So I like to think of water from different angles. One, it's a ubiquitous, a global thing where the entire economies are based on, but also every single thing that you do and you are is based on the fact that water also is this very strange molecule.
Oh, Alok, thank you so much. That was absolutely riveting. I was scrolling down about 100 questions that I could follow up. We could all follow up with that. That was totally fascinating. Thank you. And for anyone, don't forget that Alok's book is available from any good bookstores, including you could get it online as well. Anyway, now I'm absolutely thrilled to present our next speaker, Adam Nicholson, who is an award-winning writer of many books about nature, about poetry, about literature, about Greek myths. One of my favorite books of Adam is called The Sea View, which is about life on the Shanks Islands. And in fact, he's going to be showing some slides of Scotland in his talk. His latest book is about the tidal zones, that area between the beach and the sea, which is probably where most of us first learnt about going to the sea. So it's called Life Between the Tides, and details of it will be on our information sheets. But please welcome Adam Nicholson to our screens. Adam.
Thank you so much. I loved hearing Alok talk like that about water as a kind of incredibly familiar and incredibly strange thing. And the point about that zone between the tides, the intertidal zone, is that there is a place where you can look at water and its life. You can actually stick your nose into it, and everything there, unlike most terrestrial ecologies, doesn't or can't run away. I mean, Olympic will try to run away, but Olympic will move, and I think it's about an inch a minute. So you're well in there. And the point about this is that, you can only care about water and its life if you know it. You can only know it if you look at it, and you can only look at it if it sort of remains there in a kind of natural aquarium in front of you. And so there's a fascinating example of a way in which the intertidal ecology reveals the structure of the nature of life itself. And it was discovered by a man called Bob Payne, a kind of very cool, tall New Englander, 6 foot something high, in the early 1960s. And he took a small patch of shore on the coast of Washington State, on the Pacific shore, but just a few yards. And in that stretch of coast, there was a rich and complex multi-layered ecology with, I think, about 15 species interacting there, preying on each other, being preyed on by the others, sea anemones and whelks and limpets and barnacles and all the range of things you'd expect to find on the shore. A big mussel, and at the top of that net, that kind of mesh of interactive life, was this giant sea star called the Pisaster, a great carnivorous, huge purple sea star. And Payne decided to do a small experiment with this patch of the shore, and with a crowbar, a necessary crowbar, he wrenched the sea stars off the shore and threw them out into the ocean. And if ever during the course of the year that he ran the experiment, a sea star returned, he would wrench it off again and throw it out into the sea. And so the question he was asking was, what would happen to an ecology if you removed its top predator? And most of us think of predation in nature as probably rather a destructive mechanism. It kills things. What Payne discovered for the first time was that if you remove a top predator, the entire ecology beneath it collapses, that those things that the predator had been preying on start to dominate themselves. In this case, the big mussel, the big Californian mussel, which almost literally shouldered the sea anemones, the nudibranchs, the sea slugs, the barnacles, the little chitons, lots of little sea snails. The mussel shouldered them out of the way, so that by the end of the year, this complex world, which had the 15 species interacting in it, had crashed to 6 species, almost entirely dominated by the mussels. So what Payne called this was a trophic cascade, that by removing the top predator, a cascade of damage rippled down through the ecology, so you were left with a diminished and impoverished world. And all of that complex beauty, which people, when they look at the shore, so often see as a state of kind of calm, resolved calm, in fact had been revealed to be a state of kind of competitive tension, held in a kind of almost a sort of terrified paralysis by the presence of the top predator. And so what does it say about life? That life on Earth is not a kind of gathering of calm companions on Earth. The lamb is not lying down with the lion. We live in a state of acute tension with our companions on Earth. And the point about this is that the main effect that humanity has had on the nature of the world as a whole, not only in the water world, but in all biomes and in all environments, is to break that tension by, from the Paleolithic onwards, killing the great predators and leaving us with this terrible biocrisis that we are at last becoming aware of a kind of crashing populations in every part of the world. So that's, for me, I don't know if I've reached the end of my time here, maybe in a minute I can go on. For me, the value of the shore, the value of that glimpsed water world at the shore, is really to allow one to know what life is, in a way that driving through the Lake District or holidaying in some beautiful island in the Caribbean would never reveal to you.
Oh, Adam, thank you so much. That was so lovely. I love the idea that you can have a window into the whole world just on the seashore. And I think that's probably why we're all so endlessly fascinated by rock pools, that they do capture the imagination and show you a small world within a world, but in fact tells every story, and extremely interesting about the main predator. Now we're going to talk about a very big animal, the whales, and I'm very happy to welcome Doreen Cunningham to this session. Doreen has been working as a climate change researcher. She's worked as a journalist and editor. She's won many, many awards for her work. But what she's been doing recently is following whales and studying what happens to whales, or what is happening to whales, I should say, as a result of climate change, and which is very important, as we have hinted at before, I mean, what that is doing to the ocean. So, Doreen, over to you.
Thank you, Rosie. And yes, I'm going to take you to the Pacific Ocean to meet an extraordinary community, and one that I believe is an example of qualities we all need in order to navigate change in relation to the climate crisis, including resilience, adaptability, and care for each other. And we're going to meet the grey whales. This is a baby grey whale in the picture in the birthing lagoons in Baja, California, Mexico. And to the right of the picture is the hand of my 2-year-old. These whales are very playful in the lagoons. The mothers came up to the boats and checked us out, and my 2-year-old sang, and then a baby whale came to him. And this photo is from the beginning of a long journey. My toddler and I followed the migration of the grey whale mothers and calves from Mexico to the Arctic in 2013. It was after I'd had a rough couple of years. I'd been a successful BBC journalist, but after becoming a single parent, I found I wasn't able to afford childcare to work. I'd had a messy breakup, I'd gone through court, I'd been living in a hostel. I was at a low point. And it was then that I learnt about the grey whale migration and was inspired by their extraordinary endurance. I got a bank loan and I took my son to follow the whales on their 5,000-mile journey north from the birthing lagoons in Mexico to the Arctic feeding grounds. Now, this is one of the baby grey whales there riding on its mother's flukes. And I learnt so much from the whales during this journey. They swam, Max and I followed them on land using public transport. I learnt about endurance, about playing, and about overcoming trauma. The whales weren't always friendly to humans in those lagoons. They were slaughtered almost to extinction there in the 1900s, and the whalers called the greys devilfish. When the calves got in the way of the harpooners' sights and were struck, the mothers showed desperate ferocity. And in 1874, Captain Charles Melvin Scammon wrote that the parent animal in her frenzy will chase the boats, overturn them with her head, or dash them in pieces with a stroke of her ponderous flukes. So, for a long time after, as numbers recovered, greys were hostile until in about 1972, a local fisherman, Francisco Majoral or Pachico, struck up a relationship with an adult female who allowed him to stroke her. And this friendly behavior spread from there. So I learned about trusting again from the whales, and I learned about mothering in a climate crisis. Grey whales are interesting, partly because they aren't. And what I mean by that is that they aren't as well known as the giant blue whales. They're not as openly charismatic as humpbacks. They don't have the striking uniform of the orcas. They're just medium sized, they're knobbly, they're grey. But as well as their inspiring endurance, they can teach us, if we're willing to learn, because they're changing their behavior in response, as Rosie said, to changes in the ocean. Now, the grey whale's prize at the end of their migration are the amphipods that they prefer to eat. Amphipods are a tiny crustacean abundant in the benthic mud in cold Arctic waters. But those waters are warming. Greys, though, are gurus of managing the unknown. They survived the ice ages by being flexible on diet, and they seem to manage stress well, perhaps due to genetic advantages, including in DNA maintenance and repair and immune responses. And the hope is that all of this could help them survive in the warming, changing ocean. Now, I'm going to introduce you to one whale in particular, a female grey named Earhart by researchers. Earhart is a founder of a group of whales called the Sounders, who have discovered a new food source, risking their lives in the act. The marine biologist John Calambakidis first spotted her in Puget Sound in 1990 and has seen other whales following her since. The Sounders stop off here during their migration to spend months sucking up mud soup and filtering out ghost shrimp in the shallow intertidal zone. Now, those whales could easily become stranded on an outgoing tide if they misjudged their direction or timing. And close to shore, there's also the danger of entanglement, toxins, and being hit by boats. But this area functions as a sort of emergency food bank when other sources are scarce. And a mass grey whale die-off began in 2019. You can see here the population line and the very sudden drop that starts around that time. hundreds have washed up dead, a large proportion of them poorly nourished, and over the past 2 years, increasing numbers of underfed whales have been seen to join the sounders, leaving in better condition. So here is the grey whale showing adaptability, feeding not in the benthic mud, but in the pelagic zone on whatever it can get its baleen on, basically. And I like to think about the grey whales as a species that we can learn from. And when I'm overwhelmed by the environmental and social challenges that face us, I remember the intelligence and the communities that exist in the ocean. And when I think about the grey whale mothers, I always find strength. And I want to share that, which is why I wrote this book, Soundings, which was about our journey from Mexico to the Arctic. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much. That was absolutely brilliant. I've got lots of questions I want to ask you about what would happen to the oceans when whales weren't there. It's a very interesting follow-on from what Adam was saying. But I'm now very happy to introduce our last speaker of the day, who's Tobias Jones. And Tobias is joining us from Italy. Tobias is a writer as well as a researcher and a fantastic journalist and digs into things brilliantly. And he's written a book about the River Po, which is an elegy for Italy's longest river. And we particularly wanted Tobias to come and be with us tonight because he's at the sharp end of what happens when the water literally runs out, what it does to the surroundings, what it does to the agriculture. You're going to find out now. It's not a great story. Tobias, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. So I'd like to talk to you about Italy's longest river, the Po. It's 652 kilometers. And for my latest book, I traveled the river from the delta to the source, from near Venice to the Italo-French border up in the Alps. And it was a scary insight into drought and desertification in southern Europe. Here you can see what should have been the river in Saluzzo, just southwest of Turin. And this was in 2021, so a year before the really severe drought of last summer. And as you can see, it was very easy to walk from one side of the river to the other without getting your feet wet. You simply couldn't see or find the river. And here's why. If I can pass this slide on. So this is courtesy of the Drought Observatory of Italy's Institute for Bioeconomy. And you can see very clearly that the areas of Italy most affected by drought aren't, as you might expect, in the south, but at the moment in the north. The drainage basin of the River Po is very roughly the top third of the Italian boot, precisely the areas on this slide showing the most marked drought conditions. SPI, by the way, is the standardized precipitation index, and the numbers afterwards refer to the months of duration in which the measurements have taken. So obviously 24 is 2 years. So to explain this drought is in some ways very simple. There was 40% less rain than average in 2022. And with higher temperatures, there's more evapotranspiration, meaning what little rain we do actually get evaporates faster. And in this story, agriculture is both a culprit and a victim. It's a cause of the drought for many reasons. Agriculture accounts for 71% of all the waters drawn from Italian lakes, rivers, and aquifers. And the issue isn't just the amount of water it uses, but how it's wasted. So in intensive farming using fossil fuel fertilizers, there's this creation of a dusty, inert soil, which has negligible water retention, not least because barely a tree is left standing. But what we farm is also very relevant and part of the problem. As Alok said, to create a kilo of beef requires, according to the Water Footprint Network, 15,415 litres of water, compared to just over 300 litres of water for a kilo of veg. And the pollutants from this, from agriculture also damage the quality of the water. And as that water becomes rarer, the concentration of those pollutants obviously increases. So phosphates and nitrates from fertilizers cause eutrophication, which means the excessive richness of nutrients which create algal blooms and reduces oxygen in the water with terrible consequences for the life underneath the surface. So here you can see a rather cute koipu, an invasive species introduced from South America, which referring to what Adam said, completely upended the ecosystem on the water, and you can see this eutrophication rather like a Gulf fairway, and it's something you see all the way along the River Po. Estimates of the dissolved inorganic nitrogen load carried by the Po into the Adriatic oscillates between 50 and 200,000 tons per annum. But obviously agriculture is also the victim of the drought. So last summer, the flow of the River Po was so slow that salinated seawater crept up the delta and into the river as far as 40 kilometers up inland, destroying crops and ruining water for drinking fountains. Unable to irrigate, many farmers decided to forego the usual second plantings in early summer. And this obviously meant that yields were reduced, but those yields were also in decline because parched plants are more susceptible to parasitic and fungal infestations. And many of you, I assume, will have enjoyed, so this is the farmland that are affected by droughts. At the top, these are percentages of farmland. At the top, you can see that obviously the irrigated or flooded areas were most affected. So in the last 2 years, that's almost 30% of Italian agriculture that uses irrigation has been affected by drought. Particularly, here you can see the famous paddy fields. So I'm sure most of you, I hope, have enjoyed Italian risotto. This is the River Po from halfway between Casale Monferrato and Turin, the famous paddy fields. Last year, rice production in Italy, because of the drought, was down 30%. Grasslands providing forage for herds and flocks, the produce was down 35 to 40%. And with less forage, obviously, costs again creep higher, or else cattle and other animals eat less and produce less milk, cheese and meat, therefore increasing prices again and leading to food inflation. And it's going to be worse this year. Already in February, we know that 8,000 hectares of Italian paddy fields haven't been planted because of the lack of water. Local economies have been decimated, so tourism in spa towns and ski resorts have been affected. Many towns in Piemonte, in the mountains, are reliant upon water tankers. And there's even been loss of life as glaciers, like in the Marmolada last summer, suddenly give way to gravity, the ice melt acting like oil rather than, when it's actually ice, as glue. So just to wrap up, let me take you to the source of the river. This is Monvisa, where the Po rises, and there you can see in the foreground the Po reduced to a little trickle. There's the famously sort of triangular mountain. And what do you notice? That here at 3,814 meters at the peak, there's no snow. And that too increases costs, because as precipitation decreases, hydroelectric power, a clean energy source, the power production actually plummets. So here you can see on this graph the last 7 years of HEP production in Italy. At the bottom there in the sort of turquoise, you can see 2002. And there to the left at the very bottom, you can see the opening weeks of 2023. So it's not looking good. Thank you.
Tobias, thank you. Well, that was very chilling. It's also very startling how quickly this has happened, but maybe I will come back to this in a minute. But first of all, to everyone who's listening, do now start putting your questions into the chat box. I'm just going to have a lightning fire around the panel with a few questions of my own. And starting with Alok, the thing that really many things interest me about water and what you said, but one of them that I can never quite understand is that you say we have a finite amount of water, and for millennia it's gone round and round and surfaced through dinosaurs and through the local river. So why is it actually, when we say something like a cotton t-shirt uses up X amount of tons of water, doesn't that water just come back in? Doesn't all the water keep on going? Why are we losing it?
Yeah, so it goes back to the water cycle. So yes, eventually all of the water that you use that's inside you, all the water that's used will go back to the rivers eventually, and be once it's been used, but it just takes a long time. So if you think back a few thousand years ago, any humans using water, there was so much water around that anything they used that they made dirty or whatever that was flowed into the sea, there was plenty more going on elsewhere. And when there was no heavy industry, there was no production of large scale crops and industry and other things like that, we used a very small percentage of it. Now we've started to use lots more of it. Once you use, let's say, the water in a t-shirt factory or a car factory or a computer chip factory, any of these places, that water is polluted. You can't then drink it. So then that's usually sometimes it's treated, but most often it's just dumped into the rivers, and then it goes off into the sea. And the natural processes, in other words, evaporation from the oceans and into the clouds and things, will, of course, clean that up. But it could take 10,000 years before it gets back into a place where you can then re-extract it. And so where these factories exist, where the farms exist, they're extracting water at such a scale. If you look at the American West, for example, where there's basically deserts in Arizona, they have enormous agriculture because what they've done is to extract water just like oil, thousands and thousands of gallons per minute from the very deep aquifers, which have been there for thousands of years. And that's not going to get replenished for another 1,000 years. So it'll get used up within a few hundred years or even a few decades. So that disappears, and that place will be forever dry, at least for the next number of generations. Once they've gone and used that, you'll just move on to another bit of land where the groundwater is then used up. So the water does exist. It's just not in the right places.
What could we do with desalination? Is it just a dream of people in the Gulf with endless amounts of energy to make it happen?
So desalination is a technology to essentially boil water or put it through filters that take away the salt. And it means that perhaps, you could use seawater or brackish water or polluted water of any sort to actually, if you put it through that, then you can use the fresh water for whatever purpose you want. It's very expensive, and it's been around for decades, but it's still very expensive. The technology exists, but it's expensive, and the only places where it's become economical for water consumption, as in drinking water, is places like the Gulf where they can afford to do that. We have some in London too. Desalination does exist there, but it's a very small amount. Some factories and companies will desalinate water or for themselves to get hyper pure water for whatever purposes they want, but it's expensive. It's very, very, very expensive. And it costs a lot of energy too, by the way. So if you're going to start to desalinate scales and orders of magnitude more water, then you're adding to the carbon pollution problem. You're adding to all sorts of other problems too. So it's not a simple thing to scale up. It is potentially a solution though. And I certainly know of people coming up with even better filters, even cheaper filters, even more energy filters that can be used with a lot less energy. So that's great, but that's not going to solve the current problems we have in any sort of large scale. If you think about expanding that around the whole world, it's going to take 20, 30, 40, 50 years before that becomes something that we can potentially use.
Okay, so that avenue is not great. What is in a short space of time, what are your solutions to what we do about a problem that, as we heard from Tobias, is happening very fast and very catastrophically I
feel like the one thing that every person, whether you're an individual or a company or a country or whatever, is awareness, right? We just don't have any clue how much water we use. So these numbers that I give you, about 15,000 liters for a t-shirt and whatever for a pound of beef and everything, it surprises people still to this day. And of course, we don't educate ourselves about these things at all. So we all talk about carbon footprints these days when it comes to energy and our environmental impact, but water footprints are a thing we should talk about. It's a concept that was invented a couple of decades ago, but it really hasn't caught on yet, but perhaps it should. What is your water footprint every single day? How much water do you use? I mean, people in the United States use double or triple the amount of water compared to someone in India, for example, per person, and much more compared to someone in Africa. It's perfectly possible to live a very rich life without using as much water as people do in, let's say, the industrialized nations of this country, of the world. You don't need to flush 8 liters of water in your toilet every single time. Things like that actually do make a difference. And even if they're not going to make the amount of water available in your country very different, the fact that you're aware of it is a spur, I think, to other action, to other awareness. You know, buying cotton or buying clothes that have some sort of water footprint that's lower is also a commercial pressure that we should be thinking about. I mean, the carbon footprint has taken a long time to get into public consciousness, but people do think about it and can do things with it. I think water footprints are probably the most important thing to think about.
Well, that's a fantastic answer and very interesting, and absolutely a really good one to leave as one of your final thoughts. So Adam, I mean, I know that you talk about the question of what the rising sea level, rising temperatures in sea level and ocean acidification is doing to the shoreline. Can you spell that out a bit more for us?
Yes, I mean, the acidification problem is really severe, that with a more acid sea, it's obviously very difficult for shelled animals to make their shells. And so there is definitely a kind of increased vulnerability of those sea snails, the limpets, winkles, and so on. But more disturbingly, experiments have shown, I know, that if you raise bony fish or shelled animals like conches in acidified water, it starts to mess with their mental processes. I mean, people sometimes laugh at me when I talk about fish and snails having mental processes, but there's no doubt they do. And an extraordinary experiment was done in Australia with one kind of conch, which was put into a tank of acidified water with a barrier, a transparent barrier. And on the other side of the barrier was its enemy, which knew how to throw darts at it, fatal darts at it. And the conch usually has a mechanism by which it can spring away from its enemy, and a whole length of itself it can spring away. In acidified water, the rate at which those shellfish sprang away dropped by half, and not in the right direction, often in a dangerous direction. So an acid sea is actually meddling with the mechanisms by which life lives. So it's not just a kind of mechanical thing. You're going to have fewer snails. These things are not going to be able to decide how to be in future. I mean, it's really radical, the destruction that it will wreak.
Goodness, that's very, very scary. Doreen, you studied a lot of indigenous communities when you were following the whales, and I wonder what lessons you learnt from them, and also taking those lessons into the kind of community action we have in the UK, which I think has been very responsible for the public outcry about pollution of our rivers. Do you see sort of similarities between those two things in terms of being able to protect this precious substance?
Yes, definitely. I mean, you're right. I was privileged enough to be able to live with the Inupiaq people in the Northern Arctic, Northern Alaska, when I was a young journalist. And that's where I headed back to on the whale journey with my son. Now, the Inupiaq have this extraordinary relationship with the natural world around them based on the bowhead whale hunt, which holds up the entire spiritual aspect and the physical aspect of the community. And when I was living there, I was privileged enough to take part in a hunt and really understand how the bowhead has nourished these people over centuries, and how respectful that relationship is. Even the language, the way it talks about animals is very different from our language, and how we, the different way we name the bowhead whale. For instance, bowhead is about the shape of its jaw. That's a whaling term. Balena mysticetus, that's about categorizing it in a hierarchy of life. Arvik, the name in Inupiaq is about the person of the whale. There's no word for it in Inupiaq, and it was terribly inspiring to me and very strengthening for me to be part of that culture for a little while, or to experience that culture for a little while, and to live in a family. And yes, I think about that a lot, because back here, the very encouraging signs that I see are when people are starting to reclaim the relationship with the land around them, the water bodies around them, the rivers around them. I'm a wild swimmer. I love to swim outside in the sea. And obviously, last year it was horrendous. People couldn't swim, and people are becoming ill, swimming in different bodies of water. And this intimate relationship with the ground that we're standing on, wherever we are, I think is very, very important going forward.
Thank you for that. Tobias, what's going to happen in Italy? I mean, you painted a really, really drastic picture and then said this year's going to be worse, and already the harvests are right down. It's very drastic, isn't it?
It is. I try and be optimistic, and Italians are brilliant hydrological engineers. Think about the ancient Romans, and there's over 250,000 kilometers of canals and irrigation channels in the country, and they only at the moment capture 11% of rainfall. So there's obviously the potential to maintain more water there. One of the problems here is that the country is very decentralized. There are regional and provincial governments, and trying to, even in a river that is entirely within the Italian borders, trying to legislate for what can be done with that water or to that water is very difficult. But I think for me, that's the key thing about the protection of rivers and water in general, is that that it requires a human wisdom and compromise. And there's a very good book about water by Italian author Giulio Boccaletti, who made the point that sort of the democracies in the ancient world was actually driven in part by the need to, as he said, develop institutions to manage the consequences of a sedentary life in a world of moving water. That we need, I think now, democratic institutions that reflect the complexities of the problem. And I don't think that, the democracies we've got, either in Italy or Britain, are capable of doing that, and that we need far more sophisticated ways as human beings of interacting with our water resources. I personally don't think that finite natural resources should be a source of profit, and that billions of pounds being creamed off by water companies who are ignoring the central problem, I think, is a scandal. So I think that should be addressed. And the last thing I would say is that throughout history, the way in which the River Po has been talked about is rather like an Old Testament god. It's absolutely feared because of its flooding. And the problem was, ironically, there was too much water in the past. It was feared, and yet it was loved. There used to be 300 mills for milling flour along the Po. It used to be where everyone went to wash their clothes. It was a thing of of great social importance. And then it became, as Eliot said in the Four Quartets, what men choose to forget. And I think it needs a sort of almost a re-spiritualization of our relationship with the natural world.
That's very interesting. Yes, I can see it. But you can see with other rivers. I mean, I once lived in the Arabian Gulf a very long time ago, and we used to get all the vegetables in the world used to come from Iraq, where they were utilized by the Tigris and the Euphrates. And now there's no vegetables grown there at all. A whole world has just dried up. And indeed, it's the cause of a lot of wars. Alok, where do you see the kind of how do we cope with war politically on a global stage? This is in fact a question that's coming in from the audience. So I'm now coming to all your questions about the wars that water will cause and the need probably to have some kind of global solutions.
People talk about water wars, and it's not that these things won't happen, but I feel like actually what water and the changing availability of it does is to exacerbate tensions that already exist between sovereign nations. For example, in large parts of Northern Africa, as the temperatures go up because of climate change, and it gets harder and harder to grow crops because of the lack of availability of water. People will just abandon their homes and settlements and cities and move north, and that is causing already tensions with Southern Europe, who a part of the continent that has to deal with an influx of migrants who want to live, basically, because where else are they going to go? That pattern is repeated all over the world, and people will go to places where there are water, and people will move away from the places that are getting drier, of course. How do you deal with this? Well, I mean, it's hard to sort of come up with a solution that is grand enough for the sort of challenge that we face, right? Climate change is moving things very, very quickly, and so the process by which we, as a world, try and deal with climate change, which is incredibly slow, the UNFCCC meetings every year, the COPs that happen every November, December. The most recent one was in Egypt. That's a process that deals with climate change, but ridiculously, until a couple of years ago, they'd never mentioned water. They've only started thinking about water very recently, and it's because and that is the format, that is the forum rather for these conversations to happen. To your question, there is no other forum we have to deal politically with these things. But unfortunately, for decades now, in the environmental policy world, people just haven't thought about water because it's always there, and it slips between the cracks of at the global level. People say, oh, well, this is a sovereign, national or local issue. The local issue, people say, well, actually, no, it's a global issue, and so no one's thought about it at all. So you can tell we're coming late to this problem. Now, people are starting to talk about it. What does it mean? Well, it means, it means countries agreeing their borders, that this is how the water tables are going to change, who can extract what. Our laws around the world are pretty ancient when it comes to deciding how much water people can extract. Just one example I'll give you: in Arizona, for example, in this, the reason that China and other places are buying up all the desert land and then sucking out all the groundwater is because the owners of any land in the United States, have what's called the fair use doctrine. They can use as much water as they like. And there's no rules and regulations about it, because the American West, you're not allowed to give any rules. That's causing lots of problems to that country. We need to think about completely new ways of understanding that these things are finite in a world of industry. I'm not sure I gave you an answer, but I think there are tentative solutions out there. It's going to take a hell of a long time, but the most irritating thing about it all is that only in the last few years have people started thinking about this, possibly the most important of problems.
That's very interesting. I've got quite a lot of questions that have come in about people asking what they can do, and I'm just warning you at the end, I'm going to ask you all what we personally should do. But Adam, you live in the southeast, and we've got a question here about why on earth do we keep on building houses in places like the southeast where we know there isn't enough water?
Well, I think,
and why can't we pipe it as well?
Well, we could pipe. I mean, I could sit and listen to Alok all day on this, because he just speaks pure wisdom about it, and it is clearly an issue of education. I know that the average water use per person, well, someone surveyed last year what people thought the average water use per person in the United Kingdom was, and people said somewhere between 20 and 30 litres per household per day. The actual figure is something like 120 litres per person per day. It is, people simply have no idea what we're doing with water. I know also in Denmark, the average water use is 80 litres per person per day. That is an entirely, obviously developed, sophisticated European society. And so there is simply a level of ignorance. As Alok says, we don't know what we're doing. And it's not knowing what we're doing that is really destroying the aquifers. The aquifers are the great abused environment, the great hidden environment equivalent to the seafloor, which has been trashed. And those two water worlds, our civilization, have wrecked and are wrecking at an increasing rate. And I think it's that recognition and the sort of political energy that would come from that understanding that is what's needed now. I mean, there are techno fixes, pipes, pushing water from wet parts of the country to dry parts and so on. But really, it's a mind issue. People have got to know it.
Yes, well, we have a question here that came in about 10 minutes ago after Tobias had talked about making the point about the re-spiritualization of water and how can we go about this. Doreen, what would you say to that? Because it's about valuing something that we've all just taken for granted as coming boringly out of the tap.
I think so. I think it's also about acknowledging that it is home to other species, to other beings. It's not just us who use the water. It's a shared resource, not just for humanity. We evolved in the water, but so did a lot of other things.
Yes. Well, how could we use that in a constructive way? Say in the UK right now. We know we have drought problems at times, but we also have this massive problem about the way that the water companies, and again, this has come up so much, the water companies are abusing their rights.
Well, sorry, is that for Tobias?
No, it's to you. Well,
it's Adam. Okay, yeah, Adam, come in first, and then I'll come back to Doreen.
The real failing on that front is the failure of the regulators. The government has these two regulators of water, one called Ofwat, which is about providing cheap water to the people, the other called the Environment Agency to try and guarantee that the river environments are in good state. And Ofwat just wipes the floor with the Environment Agency whenever they have a meeting at the Treasury. And the cheap water emphasis of the British government has effectively destroyed the rivers. And I don't think it needs to be a spiritual change, it's an intellectual change, understanding what is actually required.
Yes, and I think also it is a byproduct of a very greedy system. When Southern Water, your water company presumably, got fined for discharging sewage onto the southern beaches, and they were fined 90 million. And when the magistrate handed out the fine, he said, "Does this worry you?" And apparently the head of Southern Water just said, "It's cheaper to pay the fine than to fix the sewage system." So it strikes me that's a pretty criminal offence. I mean, you can get banged up in jail for, playing fast and loose with your benefit system.
They waste a third of the water they abstract, and it's cheaper to abstract clean water than to mend the pipes. It's a catastrophically badly run system. Yeah.
Tobias, one of the things that came in here, question about agriculture, that where you're talking about Italy, but about lots of the world, and Alok referred to it as well about agriculture. Agriculture is both the victim of no water, but also in lots of cases, it is the reason for it. As Alok said, 70% of the world's water gets guzzled up by agriculture, particularly production of beef and other animal products. So what do we do, given that is the reality of what we're in at the moment?
Well, I mean, I'll tell you a quick anecdote. That first photograph I showed of the missing river at Saluzzo, and I was there thinking, well, where's the river? How can I have lost the river? And I walked 100 meters and found a farmer and said, "Where's the river?" And he said, "Oh, it always goes missing at this time of year." And next to him was a tractor that was churning over, ticking over and diesel, pumping out the fumes into the sky with a huge 10-inch hose that was gushing water across his maize that was being grown to feed cattle so that we can all eat cheap steak. So, there are no easy answers in this. I used to love a good steak, but I've been vegetarian for 6 years because I just don't think that we can continue the environmental costs of being carnivores. So, I think that's a very easy solution. And, growing maize, drenching it so that we can feed cattle, so that we can eat beef and have endless amounts of milk and yogurt and cheese. I'm afraid I just don't think is sustainable. It's not something I want to do. You know, like I say, I used to enjoy meat, but I'm afraid there are no easy solutions. And the other thing is that when something is so easy as just twisting the tap 180 degrees and water comes out, it's obvious that you take it for granted. It's when you, and as I say, happening in some Piemontese villages, when you have to go with your 8-gallon, container to go to the village pump to get your water, then you start appreciating and valuing it.
Yes, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, Doreen, do you think that it would help change it if we had the water ratings on labels? I mean, we haven't even got as far as the carbon ratings on labels, but it is at least seriously being discussed. Would water ratings make people change their behaviour?
I think as much information to inform discussion and debate as possible. I think that we all need to be having conversations about this. And yes, if we can have information on how it's being used, but also on the impacts in our daily conversations, then that is how movement is going to happen on this.
Thank you. I'm afraid I can now hear the chimes of Big Ben knocking out 7 o'clock. So I'm going to come back past everybody and just, because a lot of people are saying, what can I do? I think we've had some really interesting ideas. We know what governments need to do. I mean, they need to clamp down on the water companies. We have to reform the way we do our agriculture, not just for water, but for soil and for biodiversity. It needs complete overhaul. But the water story is a really, really important one, and it's very neglected. So on a personal level, all of us who are watching, Alok, what would you say we should do?
So become aware of your water footprint, and at home that means just count how much you're using and try very, very simple things that make you aware of how to sort of reduce your water usage, which means easy things like putting one of those things you can get for the water company, like the hippo in your toilet tank, for example, which means that every flush is less. Don't flush as much. I mean, it doesn't sound particularly hygienic, but it actually it works. You don't flush as many times as you need to, as you would. Put a filter on your shower so it uses less water every single time. These things don't sound like much, but they're all the tip of the spear. They not only would reduce your water footprint by a little amount, but it'll make you think about it much more, talk about it much more, and bore your friends about it to do the same thing, so that then you can put pressure on people and understand when a politician wants your vote, you can actually ask these questions and you'll have the facts in your head. And I think that's where we need to go with this. We need to turn water footprints into a thing that we're all doing.
Would you also say that we should all eat less meat, not just for health and biodiversity, but also for water? Yeah,
I think the eating less meat thing Tobias mentioned is one thing you can do to help the environment on every level. The thing is that there are entire countries in Asia that are going to be eating a lot more meat, so it's going to swamp whatever you do in this country. So you've got to be aware of that. However, I do think that the awareness of that is really important still, and there are other technologies that can perhaps allow you to still eat meat that are based on plants and things, but without all the footprint. But if you can't give up meat, just don't eat it one day a week. That's enough. That seems to be like a good sort of starting point. And I think the UN has said that would be a very useful thing. If the world could just do that, that would be a very good thing to do.
Thank you so much. Adam, what would you say?
I would say 1, listen to Alok. 2, love your river. Really love your river and be a river activist and push from underneath and change from the bottom up.
Yeah. Well, I think that one is actually working, which is great. And Doreen?
Well, similarly to Adam, speak up about the need to protect our water resources, talk about it, insist that political representatives put the environment first and hold polluters responsible. The ocean and those who live in it, underwater communities don't have a voice, and we need to be their voice.
That's a nice, very nice thought. And Tobias, finally, living the way you do and watching what's happening to Italy and will probably happen again this summer, what do you think we should do?
Well, I agree with what everyone said, really. I mean, I think it would be great if rivers could become a form of a playground again. The sides of the Po used to be beaches. In fact, they are all beaches now because the river's so low. But when I was interviewing lots of old men, they used to laugh and say, "Oh, I was conceived by the banks of the Po." So, a river that was really, full of life rather than something we ignored. And the other side of the equation, in terms of flood prevention, one of the most important things is to fight tooth and nail against the paving and concretization of land that's a garden or woodland or whatever, because the consumption of the soil means that obviously water runoff just creates more floods.
Yeah, and muddy streams going down country lanes because the soil's so weak. No, once you start to look at it, you can see it everywhere. Well, I couldn't thank you all enough. You've been absolutely great, and I think some of you have odd references to put into our chat box for people to follow up on stuff. And please buy all the books, because everything is great reading, and this is such an important subject, which I feel really privileged to have had the pleasure of being able to present to you for the last hour. Thank you all very much for joining us, and thank you again to Rathbones Investment Management for working with us on this series. Our next Earth Convention webinar is in fact 4 weeks from today, on March the 20th, at the same time as 6 p.m, and that's going to be on air, and we're going to be looking at air pollution with Rosamund Adu-Kissy Deborah, who was the mother of the little girl who died of asthma, Gabrielle Walker, who's working on extraordinary things to do with extractions of carbon, and a whole bunch of other people who are going to look at this, again, very vital and unappreciated source that is all around us. Please join us 5 by 15 soon. I am, in fact, going to be interviewing Adam Nicholson's wonderful wife, Sarah Raven, who has written a book on how to grow vegetables. And I know lots of you have already signed up, but check out our website. It's in a couple of weeks' time, and I hope to see you there. In the meantime, a very good night, and thank you for being with us.